We start today with Tecumseh, whose dates are 1768 to 1813. He was a warrior and chief of the Shawnee tribe who led a tribal confederacy until he was killed in the Battle of the Thames, pictured here. The name of the Thames was given to what was once the Pequot River after the Pequot massacres, and I want to return to Stannard for just a second here and quote him at some length from page 115. He tells us that the word Pequot was then, after the massacres, removed from New England's maps. The river of that name was changed to the Thames, and the town of that name became New London. Having virtually eradicated an entire people, it was now necessary to expunge from historical memory any recollection of their past existence. And this renaming of history, this rewriting of the past, the erasure of the memory of a people after that people's been defeated was common during this, especially during this early era of the American Indian Wars. So Tecumseh falls at the Battle of the Thames. He fought against the Proto-Americans, the colonialists, the revolutionaries, and he fought on the side of the British, in the hopes that when the Brits won, they would get the colonies under control and establish an independent Native American nation or colony out to the west. He was 15 when the American Revolutionary War ended, and having seen the violence and the dirty dealings of the American colonialists, he saw the best hope for tribes in union, in confederacy, as we see in the speech that we read. And we'll turn to that. One note on his death, though. The version portrayed in the frieze in the Capitol Rotunda in D.C. shows us at least two things. Now, this is the entire frieze. It is, in fact, a circle going the full circumference around the rotunda beneath the top. First, just by being there, the centrality of this death to the establishment of the nation's identity remains clear. The larger piece, which I've got here, and I've sort of cut and pasted the pieces so they almost perfectly fit, is called The Frieze of American History. It depicts 19 scenes in fresco, which is itself a pretty cool and very difficult technique. From the landing of Columbus to the discovery of gold in California, and the beginning of aviation at the end. It starts in the upper left corner. You can see the very beginning is America in history. And what you see there sort of allegorically rendered is history, figured as a woman writing on a tablet, sitting under and responding to America, figured as a kind of martial woman of vague liberty aspirations. And then at the end, at the very bottom right, you see a later edition. The last three were added later, the later edition of the beginning of aviation. So the first row here is focused on Spanish, Portuguese explorers, right? That's kind of what we see in the first row. The second row turns to British colonialists and their relationships to natives, such as they were. The third row really depicts scenes from the Revolution, and the death of Tecumseh is at the far right of the third row. And the fourth row depicts westward expansion and technological progress. Now, it's sort of accidental that these fit into four neatly themed rows. As I said, it is a circular work of art in its form. Above this frieze, in the eye of the rotunda, that centerpiece above the kind of dome-shaped thing, that's called a rotunda, the eye of the rotunda, what we see is a painting called The Apotheosis of Washington. Now, I've just sort of zoomed in from left to right so that on the left you can kind of see the dome, then you get in the center a little closer, and by the right side image what you see is Washington himself in his apotheosis. Now, this is the making of Washington into a god. That's what apotheosis means. It means the making of a human into a god. The art commissioned for the Capitol building was really intended to make plain this mythos, the mythos of America's founding. It's a little heavy-handed for our modern tastes, maybe. It's unlikely that we'd, centralize an image on the, representing the apotheosis of any modern president, but you can sort of imagine Lincoln, maybe. It was very common for Washington, even during his life, to have this sort of mythic appeal attached to him in grand stature. But this is the story given for the development, the institution of a nation. It is the most official version of the mythos in a lot of ways. And again, the death of Tecumseh which stands in as the death of or the destruction of any chance of a unified Native America, a native confederacy of tribes, is in there. It said that Colonel Richard Johnson killed Tecumseh. That's what's pictured in the frieze that officially adorns the rotunda, that we have on the right here and we've seen before, and that you see at the top of the on the top screen of the website where you access the speech. It said that Colonel Richard Johnson killed Tecumseh, and that story carried Johnson to the White House as vice president under President Van Buren. The sort of fame that went along with that. Probably that's not how it went down. It's probably not what happened. But among all of the conflicting narratives that go into this moment, it's the one that stuck. And the image of it from the Capitol frieze shows up, like I said, at the top of the speech on the website I sent you. And that website, which is itself titled History as a Weapon, I just want to make mention, it is an incredibly rich repository or archive of primary source texts, all of which are relevant to this class. This is the only speech that I will, the only text or resource that I'll direct you to that site in order to access, but really I encourage you to spend some time there. There's nothing on that site that's not relevant to this course. Now the speech itself, "Sleep not longer, O Choctaws and Chickasaws," is a call to unity in the interest of peace, independence, justice. If it weren't, if we are ourselves not sort of really thoroughly embedded in the history from an existential first-person stance, like imagine that we're future historians from a different place looking back on this, on these texts, reading this speech, it recalls the Declaration of Independence just so strongly. I hope you saw that. Tecumseh calls his listeners to unite. He says, "Think not, Choctaws and Chickasaws, that you can remain passive and indifferent to the common danger and thus escape the common fate." This is a warning against trying to hide or escape from history, a warning against complacency in the face of injustice. You don't win from that spot, says Tecumseh. We all lose. The challenge, one of the challenges, but one primary challenge that Tecumseh faced and did not ultimately overcome was convincing very disparate people who had often been enemies in their own world to come together in the interest of a common cause, to unite according to a common set of principles. And that cause was, quoting Tecumseh, "to listen to the voice of duty, of honor, of nature, and of your endangered country. Let us form one body, one heart, and defend to the last warrior our country, our homes, our liberty, and the graves of our fathers." And surely, he goes on to say, reminding me again of the litany of charges against King George that we see appear in the Declaration of Independence, surely if any people ever had, we have good and just reasons to believe we have ample grounds to accuse the Americans of injustice. It really takes a moment to think, and articulate pretty explicitly, is there injustice? And the answer is, yeah, according to any measure. Of course, he's right. By any measure of justice in these accusations against a nation whose stated ideals are exactly those that are here invoked and celebrated and pressed upon the listeners as a moral mandate. And through this whole speech, through Tecumseh's entire project, even including his storied battlefield death and its appropriation into the founding national narrative, the whole project, in it, we can see one of history's greatest, darkest ironies. That this new nation established on as yet unheard of assertions of universal human dignity and value should find its first footing in the active destruction of tribal communities espousing, sometimes together, as with Tecumseh's Confederacy or the Iroquois Confederacy or others, espousing the very principles that the new nation sought to embody, right? It's an irony only if we, as inheritors of this history, those called upon to know it and respond to it, only if we look back with an inestimable generosity on the intentions of the founders, who were also genocidal slaveholders. Like, somehow they felt so threatened, so endangered, and so righteously justified in their cause, which, remember, was a pretty compelling cause, and we can think back to what we read from the Revolutionary period, and if you're not won over by the very stale, historically dated language of that era, you listen to the soundtrack of Hamilton, and we feel that our contemporary era feels that it is a compelling cause, the cause of the revolutionaries. So if we imagine these folks feeling so threatened and so justified that they just didn't see the bigger picture, the role they played in the experience of others, those others who were not thought of or approached as insiders or compatriots in the grand and justice-oriented project of nation building, right? If we can imagine that they just didn't see it, and if we can forgive them for that in an existential kind of way, in which one might be said to be able to forgive history, if we can see and imagine how it must have been for them, who are acting as we do now, innocent of the future, not seeing the generational after effects of our actions, of their actions. If we can do that, then this is an irony. Destroying a people who explicitly argues for and acts on the values that you claim to stand for, and that you claim are universal, applying to all peoples, including those whom you are plundering. If we can imagine that, then that's an irony, a dark and painful irony, but an irony. Or, on the other hand, it's not irony. It's not an irony at all, because they should have known, they should have seen, and they should have acted accordingly, in which case it's hypocrisy on a national scale, and it's culpable. It's complicity in evil through a willful abdication of moral integrity. And when we look at history, and the American Indian Wars really pressed this upon us, because of their scope and span, maybe, it's hard to, I don't believe that one can compare sufferings. Sufferings are incommensurable. So my suffering and your suffering, which one's greater, it's a dirty business to get into. But in the grand scope of American human history, American national history, this is a moment that presses upon us questions of moral integrity. And so I want to take just a minute to talk about what moral integrity might mean. And certainly you could argue against this. It's a formulation that I've come up with and that I believe in, but if you've got a different take, I'd be more than happy to hear it. Moral integrity, I'll claim, means really thinking about what the right thing to do is, and then really trying to do it. It requires of us both self-reflection and situational awareness. If we as humans refuse to participate in either self-reflection or situational awareness, then wherever we fall on any issue, we've neglected our moral mandate as humans, right? Moral integrity requires us as humans to practice both self-reflection. What is my role? What does my experience have to offer my understanding of this? And also situational awareness, which is to say that big picture that sometimes it's hard to see from the survivalistic personal impulses of a person or a family or a community just trying to get by in the world, right? The only morally coherent position left to a person who refuses the requirements of moral integrity, the only morally coherent position left to that person is a position that espouses no moral claims, that makes no ideals imperative. But the U.S. in its founding did. It espoused moral claims, it made ideals imperative, and it founded itself upon what we can now see as an incalculable betrayal of those ideals. So what do we do with all this? How do we live in and into this world that hands us this history? In the most general sense, keeping our judgments of history, whatever they are, pretty far from righteousness, as far as we can get. That's my response. Again, arguable, you might argue. But we'll see as we move into the present many, many times, many hints about how future historians are likely to judge us all for our own lack of awareness, for our own abdication of moral duty, for our own complacency in the face of injustice. Like every generation before us, we will be judged, and some of those judgments will be right and just and true. So judging history, shy away from the righteousness that separates yourself from it, I encourage you to think rather about the relationship that history has to our present day and how we might better bend the arc of history just a little bit more towards justice through our own actions. Okay, so now I've moved ahead in slide, and I want to take a minute here to look more closely to the present in terms of our readings. And AIM is what we'll start with, the American Indian movement, established 50 years ago or so as a cultural recuperation project that was itself not shy of taking up arms. And again, it seems worth just remembering to ourselves that to take up arms, to engage in militant revolution against unjust oppression, was described as a duty in the Declaration of Independence. It's not outside of the parameters of what the American mythos entails of us. So you read from Vernon Bellecourt about AIM's birth in the 60s in Minneapolis in response to what it saw as structural violence, widespread systemic poverty, and police brutality against Native Americans in Minneapolis. Not that these issues are confined to Minneapolis, not by a long shot, but for us now it seems notable. That structural violence came to be seen manifested in a wide range of socioeconomic issues beyond poverty and police brutality. Disparities and challenges facing Native Americans and the goals and purpose of AIM has grown accordingly. AIM remains active. It established the International Indian Treaty Council, the IITC, in 1974, decades ago, which worked with the UN, and in 2007, at long last, that body helped in getting the UN General Assembly to pass the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It was a pretty wide-ranging statement on what sorts of rights should be accrued to and are warranted to Indigenous peoples, self-determination, the rights of sacred landscapes, a long list. You can look it up. It's worth looking up. 144 states, nation-states, countries voted in favor of this. 11 abstained. 4 voted against it. And this, this is discouraging. The 4 who voted against were the U.S., Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, who thought that it just went too far, right? And so America remains part of the global structural national body dedicated to assertively not taking up statements articulating the rights of Indigenous folks. But AIM continues. They've split since. There are 2 main branches, some other branches, and some folks continue to disagree with their principles, even with their now nearly exclusively nonviolent methods. But they continue to work towards justice. They participated in the Standing Rock protests. Native Roots Radio online is a good place to start if you're interested in looking more into these folks. A couple of these images are taken from the occupation of the Alcatraz Island for 18 months, some decades back. And the long walk, the first of 2 long walks, is to Washington, also pictured. I might mention that in the American Indian Movement Students Organization that's in the top center, the upside down American flag, just worth knowing that according to the code of flag etiquette, an upside down American flag, it means something. It is symbolic, and actively so. It's a signal of distress. So when it's used, it's often thought of by the general populace to mean a rejection of the American ideals, or a rejection of this symbol of national coherence, a rejection of all things that are sort of held sacred by that dominant status quo. But it's worth knowing that an upside-down American flag is an American gesture. It's part of the flag code. It's part of the uniform flag code. It means distress. It signals distress within the language, the symbolic language of America itself. So just worth noting. And then there's Momaday's approach, which we'll close with. Those of you who have, I just pictured some of his books at the bottom. If you've read some N. Scott Momaday, you'll know that this fellow's he's a good writer, and worth looking into if you haven't. Here's a quote that I found that I think speaks well to our goals in this class, in terms of mythos versus logos, in terms of self-understanding, identity, ideology, and how those perpetuate themselves in mostly unthinking ways through culture, what Quinn referred to again as mother culture, right? We are what we imagine. Our very existence consists in our imagination of ourselves. Our best destiny is to imagine, at least completely, who and what, and that we are. The greatest tragedy that can befall us is to go unimagined. And in the context of this class, I'd like to say that tragedy, that going unimagined, involves not looking at the ideals that shape us, involves not looking at the mythos, involves not seeing it as the narrator in Quinn's Ishmael sort of didn't see it at first. That unimagined self, or unreflective self, that's the great tragedy for Momaday. And we read a little bit from him, an excerpt in which he responds to Columbus as a figure, Christopher Columbus, pictured at the bottom, and he sees him as a tragic figure. He says, we got to remember that this guy, he didn't know what he was in for. Again, innocent of the future, had no idea the world he was he was walking into and helping to create. Does it relinquish him of all responsibility? No, of course not. But seeing him as a tragic figure, as somebody who Mamadei reminds us died thinking that he had made it to China. We just didn't know. It allows an opening to sort of consider this figure within the larger mythos from any perspective, imaginatively. But something sticks out to me about what it is that he writes. He says that he's not as optimistic as he used to be, right? He's not as optimistic as he used to be, but he does think we need to operate on hope. And I'm with him on that, I'd like to be more optimistic than I am. But I do hold to the hope that keeps me even now, even under the burden of all of this history and present reality to boot, keeps me even now on the optimistic side of that line. But hope isn't enough. A clear-eyed vision of, approach to, and engagement with the ideals that we hold and stand for lets us practice moral integrity, to aspire to a more perfect self-reflection and an ever more perfect situational awareness. It's a pretty heady answer. I understand that, but it is an answer that points to action and requires that action be tailored to the individual and responsive to the common good. So the action will look different for each of us. There will be Bellacourts and there will be Mamadeis and countless others. But as you move through your studies and your vocations, whatever it is that you're called to do in this world, remember that your actions do manifest and support myths, whether or not you want them to. So act accordingly. It seems that we may be at a pivotal time right now in the American mythos. It seems likely that history has its eyes on us. Knowing that, I think, can help make us more self-determined interactions, more self-reflective, more situationally aware, more intentional. It can lend to our actions a kind of moral integrity in the face of, like I said, overwhelming, soul-crushing historical narratives. So next we will turn to the Mexican-American War and the grand ideological apparatus that was sort of built up during that era.